Finally, today we want to talk about one of the main reasons the president's power has grown. We want to talk about the president's war powers. So, this is something that has really happened as a result of the presidency and our whole national security apparatus responding and adapting to modern times and modern threats. Now, the president is way more powerful when it comes to making policy as it relates to war. So, what we see here, we see President Trump launching military strikes, announcing that he's launched military strikes against Syria. This did not include any input from Congress or a declaration of war from Congress or anything like that, but this is what modern presidents do. So we want to explore how war powers have changed. All right, as we talk about presidential war powers, in the background we see President George W. Bush meeting with the troops there. The president, of course, as commander-in-chief. There's always been an important relationship between the president and the military, and so we're going to explore the constitutional power struggle first. So there's always been this struggle that is set up in the Constitution in Article 1 and 2, a struggle for power over our war-making of this country. So the Constitution in Article 1 tells Congress that Congress has the power to raise an army and raise a navy. They have to raise and support an army and a navy. Congress has the ability to regulate the armed forces. Congress has the power to declare war, and Congress also has the power to control the funding for the military. But then Article 2 tells us that the president is commander-in-chief. They're responsible for leading the military, and they're responsible for military decision-making. So the initial plan the Constitution sets up in Article 1 and Article 2 is designed to prevent the president from acting alone. They want to prevent the president of the United States from being the type of leader who goes off with their own plans and starts wars and gets the United States entangled in international conflicts and stuff and tries to become some great historical leader, a Napoleon or Alexander the Great or something like that. So it's designed to prevent that, but also the president is necessary because Congress is inefficient and slow and debates everything. The president needs to be able to respond quickly. All right, so let's take a minute and talk about war. Congress, in Article 1 says Congress has the power to declare war, and then the president makes all the decisions making war. But this is really just not a system that's going to work in modern times. And so as a result, the last war that the United States was involved in is World War II. December the 8th, 1941 is the last time that Congress has ever declared war. Now, the United States has fought in several wars since then, but we have not had a single declared war. We've had wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea, countless wars over the decades, but none of these have been declared wars by Congress. What happens, the way we get around this, is the president refers to these as he's sending the troops in a police action, or he's sending the troops to deal with hostilities. The president is careful to not, when announcing a troop action, does not call this a war. It's some type of strike or some type of hostilities or some type of peacekeeping action. And in this way, they don't need Congress to take action. So Congress, over the decades following World War II, started to become concerned that it is losing its authority to decide when the United States was involved in a war, particularly after Vietnam. United States involvement in Vietnam went on in some form or another for more than 20 years, although the main part of the Vietnam War didn't last that long. But the Vietnam War was an incredibly unpopular war here in the United States. The United States military did not accomplish its mission of keeping South Vietnam free from communist North Vietnam, and the presidents really abused their power, and particularly were not open and transparent with the public when dealing with this war. So Congress wants to restrain the president after the Vietnam War, and we're going to see the result of that with the War Powers Act. All right, the War Powers Act is a very important law. We have to know this law, maybe called the War Powers Resolution sometimes when we see it. But the War Powers Act passed by Congress in 1973. So this is at the end of the Vietnam War, where Congress is trying to restrain the president's power to make war without any input from Congress. So what this law requires is, first of all, if the president is going to send the troops into any kind of action, the president must officially notify Congress within 48 hours of doing so. So the president must upfront tell Congress, I'm using the troops in this way. After 60 days, Congress has a vote. They can vote right before or not, but at 60 days, Congress has to vote on whether or not they're going to authorize this action. So Congress is voting whether or not they agree with the president using the troops in this way. But this occurs 60 days after the president has sent the troops. So without a authorization from Congress, or with Congress declaring war, then the military action has to end. So if Congress votes to not authorize this military action, then the action has to end. The troops essentially have to come home. And the way that this happens is because Congress, being responsible for the funding, Congress would essentially stop funding the military action. And that would force the military action to stop. So the president can do whatever he feels is appropriate with the military, but 60 days later, Congress has to approve or reject that action. And to reject that action, they would do so by stopping the funding of that action. So here's another important thing to understand about this act. So the War Powers Act passed in 1973. Here's a situation where Congress is passing a law that protects the powers of Congress and limits the power of the president. So this law was passed by Congress. The House and Senate agreed. It was agreed to by Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate. Richard Nixon, as president, Congress just passed a law that limits the president's power. So of course, the president is going to reject a law that limits the power of the president. So Richard Nixon vetoed this law. So this is one of the rare situations. Congress passed a law to limit the president and protect Congress. The president vetoed the law. And so Congress was able, in this situation, to override the veto. So an example of Congress using their check on the president's check. So Congress had 2/3 of the votes necessary to override the veto in the House and the Senate. So this is one of those situations where Congress was able to agree. Republicans and Democrats came together to agree because this gave them power to limit the president. So this is not a situation where Republicans and Democrats can be on the same side, because this is a Congress versus president battle instead of a Republicans versus Democrats battle. And there's a couple complicated aspects to this law. The presidents, of course, don't like this law because this does limit the president's power. The presidents would argue that this law would be unconstitutional because this law gives Congress a veto over the president. The Constitution does not say anywhere that Congress can veto the president. So the presidents argue that this is a legislative veto. This would give the legislative branch a veto over the president doing something. But the Constitution doesn't say that. Like, the Constitution does not give Congress that power, so the presidents say that Congress shouldn't be able to do it. The Constitution does not give any veto power to Congress. They only give veto power to the president. But we don't know what would happen because Congress has never attempted to stop the president with the powers that this law gives Congress. So Congress has always, in every instance that this law has been used, Congress has always approved the president's use of the troops. Congress has never actually forced the president to bring the troops home. And so this situation has never got to the Supreme Court. So we don't know how this would be settled if it got to the court. One of the reasons why Congress hasn't done this is because we mentioned that Congress would cut off funding to the military action. Now, that is a very difficult position for a congressman to defend, because if they cut off funding, it is very easy for political opponents, even though Congress is trying to limit the president's abuse of war powers, political opponents of the congressman are able to characterize this as the congressman not being willing to take care of the troops that are in danger. So any congressman who would vote against presidential action, their political opponents can easily say, this congressman doesn't want to give the troops the supplies and medical care necessary. This congressman doesn't think the troops deserve money. This congressman isn't giving the troops what they need to be successful. And that's a very politically difficult position to defend. So that's one of the many reasons why Congress has never limited the president's power using this act so far. But if Congress were to use their powers that this act gives them, we might see a bit of a struggle between the branches that would have to be decided by the Supreme Court. So, War Powers Act, very important here. This is a way that Congress limits the president's power to use the troops to make war. All right, there's President Trump surrounded by tanks. Definitely symbolic of his role as commander-in-chief here. 2 thumbs up to all of these tanks. Let's take a look at our bigly ideas, find out all the things we need to make sure and remember as we explore the ways that the presidential power has grown. All right, President Trump, phenomenal dancer, wants to make sure that you can do all of these things today. So we want to make sure that you can explain all of the reasons why presidential power has grown. So you want to be able to explain, especially think about the times of emergencies. That's one of the easy things to remember there. In times of emergency, the American people want the president to have the powers necessary to solve those problems. You want to be able to explain why the president would resort to executive orders. So make sure that you could understand that if Congress is not going to cooperate, like why would the president use an executive order? And why would the president prefer Congress to pass the law if possible? Definitely want to be able to describe the bully pulpit. It's one of those just weird vocabulary words that pops up in government class. So you need to make sure that you can describe what that is. Maybe give examples of the president using the bully pulpit. And we'll be asked to describe the limits on the president's war-making power that Congress imposed in the War Powers Act. An important law. This is a law that they highlight because it is a battle between branches. It deals with the interaction between branches. So we need to understand how Congress passes laws to limit the president's power. All right, so there we go. Definitely not everything, but we've explored a lot of the reasons why the president's power has grown, why George Washington is a very important president, but probably the weakest president that we've ever had, because each president that comes along has become more powerful than the next and inherited more powers. So now we've looked at what the president does, we've looked at what powers the president has, and now we've looked at why the president's power has grown. So we're going to shift a little bit and talk about how the president is selected.